They thought they had arrested just another undocumented Latino. But when ICE put him in chains, they had no idea he was Interpol and that a special armed team was already on the way. It was a humid morning in Houston, the kind that pressed down on the city and made every step feel heavier. On a quiet street lined with aging brick warehouses, two unmarked black SUVs rolled slowly to a stop. The tinted windows reflected the sunlight, masking the men inside. Seconds later, four ICE agents stepped out, their badges clipped to their belts, their hands resting just close enough to their holstered firearms to let anyone watching know. They weren't there for casual business. The agents weren't on a routine immigration sweep. They had been fed information by an anonymous tip line claiming a foreign national was operating illegally inside U.S. borders. What the agents didn't know was that their so-called target wasn't just any immigrant or overstayer. His name was Alejandro Torres, a 42-year-old seasoned investigator with Interpol, who had spent the last 2 decades dismantling transnational crime syndicates. But as far as ICE headquarters was concerned, Torres was just another undocumented foreigner, a problem they intended to solve quickly. Alejandro had chosen this quiet part of Houston for a reason. The warehouse he worked from wasn't marked, its faded paint and broken shutters hiding the sophisticated network of surveillance equipment inside. He had been monitoring cartel activity that spilled across the Texas border, his investigation so sensitive that even local law enforcement hadn't been briefed. To Alejandro, secrecy was safety. To ICE, secrecy was suspicion. At 8:13 a.m., the ICE team fanned out across the street, one of them barking into his radio, "Target is inside." "Move in." Without knocking, they rammed the warehouse door with a steel battering ram. The sound echoed through the street like thunder. Inside, Alejandro jumped up from his desk, his instincts honed by years of dangerous fieldwork. He reached for his identification wallet, pulling it open to reveal the red, globally recognized badge of Interpol. But before he could say a word, a pair of hands shoved him against the wall, his cheek pressed against cold concrete. "You're under arrest," one agent shouted, slapping cold handcuffs onto his wrists. "For what?" Alejandro demanded, his accented English firm but calm. "I'm Interpol. You're making a mistake." But the agents didn't listen. To them, this was just another man trying to wriggle out of custody by throwing out fake credentials. They yanked his arms back, tightened the cuffs, and dragged him toward the waiting SUV. Alejandro didn't fight. Years of experience had taught him that sometimes survival meant letting the storm pass before revealing the truth. But, as he was shoved into the back seat, his mind raced. If ICE had found him here, it meant one thing: his investigation had been compromised. As the SUVs pulled away, Alejandro caught a glimpse of his laptop left glowing on the desk. Sensitive, files still open on the screen. He clenched his jaw. If ICE got curious and accessed that data, not only would his mission be blown, but the lives of undercover agents embedded in cartels across the countries would be at risk. Inside the SUV, the ICE agents began their questioning, their tone sharp and mocking. "Where's your green card, buddy?" One sneered. "I told you," Alejandro replied evenly. "I am an officer with Interpol. Call your supervisors. They will confirm my status." "Yeah, sure," another laughed. "And I'm James Bond." They laughed, but Alejandro remained silent. He knew this wasn't just ignorance. Something bigger was at play. Someone wanted him out of the picture, and ICE had just become their pawn. By the time the convoy reached the ICE detention facility, word of the arrest had already started to ripple through unofficial channels. One of Alejandro's encrypted trackers had been triggered when his badge was separated from his person. Thousands of miles away, in a secure operations room, an alert lit up on a wall-sized screen. Within minutes, phone calls were made, approvals were stamped, and a decision was reached. A special team was being dispatched. Back in Houston, Alejandro was marched through metal detectors, his belongings bagged, and his wrists secured with heavier restraints. The ICE agents processed him like they would any detainee, snapping his mugshot and assigning him an ID number. All the while, Alejandro repeated the same line. I am Interpol. You must contact your federal liaison. But the more he insisted, the more the agents rolled their eyes. To them, he wasn't a high-ranking international officer. He was just another Latino man in custody, another file to be stamped and shelved. Hours passed. Alejandro sat in a dim interrogation room, his hands chained to the metal table. Across from him, ICE supervisors leaned in, their voices dripping with condescension. You're not fooling anyone, Mr. Torres. We've run your name, and nothing comes up. Care to explain that? Alejandro lifted his head, his dark eyes unflinching. I operate under classified authorization. Your system is not designed to hold my record, but make no mistake, you are interfering with international law enforcement. The supervisors smirked, unconvinced. They leaned back in their chairs, thinking they had broken him. But Alejandro's composure never cracked. He knew something they didn't. Every second that ticked by brought his allies closer, and when they arrived, everything, absolutely everything would change. That was when the sound of distant rotor blades began to vibrate faintly against the facility's walls. The humming of fluorescent lights buzzed above Alejandro as he sat motionless in the interrogation room, chained to a cold steel table. Hours had passed since his arrest, yet time seemed to drag on endlessly, punctuated only by the heavy footsteps of ICE officers coming and going outside. The air was thick with the sterile smell of disinfectant, mixed with the faint echo of muffled voices from adjoining rooms. It wasn't the worst cell Alejandro had ever sat in, but it was a dangerous one for here. He wasn't seen as an investigator or an ally. He was a suspect, a prisoner stripped of identity. The supervisors entered again, this time with thicker files under their arms. One was Agent Klein, tall, lean, his jaw always clenched as though he were biting back a curse. The other, Agent Murphy, had a bulldog's build and the temperament to match. They sat across from Alejandro, their eyes scanning him like predators circling prey. Let's try this again, Klein said, his voice deliberately calm. Your name is Alejandro Torres. We ran it. You don't exist in our federal system. No visa, no residency card, not even a work permit. So, who are you really? Alejandro inhaled slowly, keeping his voice even. I've told you who I am. Interpol officer, assigned to a transnational crime task force. My clearance and identity are classified. Contact your liaison with the Department of Justice. They can confirm my position. Murphy slammed a hand on the table, making the chains rattle. We don't play games here, Torres. If you think dropping the name Interpol is going to get you out of this, you're dead wrong. Until we get something concrete, you're just another illegal crossing the line. Alejandro met his stare with unnerving calm. And if you're wrong, do you understand the consequences of detaining an international officer? You risk political fallout. You risk exposing ongoing investigations. You risk lives. The room fell quiet for a beat, the weight of his words lingering in the air. But Murphy only scoffed, pushing back from the table. Save the lecture. We've heard it all before. Outside the room, a handful of ICE officers gathered near the observation window, peering in at the man they'd arrested. Some mocked him, under their breath. Others seemed less sure. One younger officer whispered, "What if he's telling the truth?" But his senior hushed him quickly, reminding him not to question orders. To most of them, Alejandro was simply a detainee wearing a mask of authority. Inside, Alejandro sat back in his chair, appearing composed, but his mind worked at lightning speed. He knew his team would come for him, but how soon would they reach him before ICE dug too deep, had hidden files inside his laptop encrypted? Yes, but not impenetrable. If ICE tried to access them, they might trigger failsafes, but even those weren't perfect. He couldn't let that happen. Meanwhile, upstairs, in the facility, Agent Klein was briefing his superior on the arrest. We think he's running an alias, claims he's some high-level international cop, but nothing checks out. My guess, he's tied to one of the cartels. Maybe even laundering money through fake credentials. The supervisor frowned. If he's cartel-connected, we'll get DHS involved. But until then, he's ours. Unbeknownst to them, that decision would prove costly. By late afternoon, Alejandro was moved to a holding cell with reinforced bars. His hands were finally unshackled, but the room offered little comfort: a thin cot, concrete walls, a toilet in the corner. Across the hall, other detainees watched him curiously. Some whispered about his composed demeanor, how he didn't look or act like the usual men brought in. Alejandro sat quietly, his eyes closed, as though meditating. But in truth, he was listening. The faint thrum of helicopter rotors had grown closer. He could distinguish the unique rhythm of military-grade craft, not civilian air traffic. He allowed himself the faintest smile. They were coming. At that very moment, a dozen miles away, a convoy of armored vehicles thundered down the freeway, escorted by black helicopters overhead. The insignia painted discreetly on their doors marked them as a multinational tactical unit, one rarely deployed, except when international protocol was being breached. The men inside were heavily armed, faces obscured by visors, their weapons locked and loaded. Their leader, Commander Vega, sat silently in the front vehicle, eyes scanning a tablet that showed Alejandro's last known location. "Our asset has been detained," he said into his comms. "Rules of engagement, minimum exposure, maximum control. ICE doesn't know what they're holding. We correct this mistake fast." Back at the detention center, the ICE supervisors were preparing another round of questioning when alarms suddenly flickered through the building. A guard ran down the corridor, whispering urgently to Klein, "Sir, we've got inbound aircraft circling, military signatures, but they're not U.S." Klein's brow furrowed. "Not U.S.? What do you mean, not U.S.?" The guard swallowed nervously. "Mixed registry, European and South American. Whoever they are, they're heavily armed." In the holding cell, Alejandro opened his eyes, sensing the shift. The ground trembled faintly beneath his feet. Outside, distant spotlights cut through the evening sky as black-clad soldiers rappelled from helicopters onto the ICE facility's roof. The agents inside scrambled to respond, alarms blaring, weapons drawn, confusion spreading like wildfire. None of them had expected this. None of them were prepared for what was about to unfold. And chained behind bars, Alejandro whispered under his breath, "Right on time." The ICE detention facility erupted into chaos. Alarms screeched across the compound. Red emergency lights flashed along the hallways, painting the walls in pulses of crimson. Guards scrambled to secure detainees. Officers shouted contradictory orders, and radios buzzed with panicked voices. But the noise inside couldn't compare to the roar outside. The thunder of helicopter blades slicing the night sky, punctuated by the growl of armored vehicles pulling into the facility's perimeter. From the observation tower, an ICE guard squinted through his binoculars. What he saw made his stomach drop. Dozens of black-clad operators were advancing across the asphalt with precision, their weapons cradled at the ready. They weren't cartel gunmen or local gangs. Their formation, gear, and discipline screamed elite military training. Whoever they were, they moved with the authority of men who expected to win. Inside, Agent Klein stormed down the corridor, barking orders, locked every entrance, no one in or out. Get back up on the line now. But before his commands could be fully executed, the facility's front gate exploded inward with a deafening crash. The steel doors folded like paper under the force of a breaching charge. A cloud of smoke billowed into the night, and out of it marched the special unit faces hidden behind tactical helmets, visors glowing faintly under the floodlights. At their head was Commander Vega, tall and unflinching, his voice cutting sharply through the chaos as he issued orders in rapid Spanish and English. "Secure the perimeter. Non-lethal force unless engaged." His tone was clipped, professional, but beneath it burned a cold urgency. Alejandro's life was priority one. ICE agents inside raised their rifles, forming defensive lines, unsure whether to shoot or hold fire. Murphy's voice cracked as he shouted, "They're invading federal ground. Stand your ground." The armed team ignored the warning. Within seconds, stun grenades clattered across the concrete floors, detonating with blinding flashes and thunderous concussions. Officers dropped their weapons, clutching their ears, disoriented by the shockwaves. Doors rattled, windows shattered, and the carefully built walls of ICE authority crumbled in an instant. Down in the holding wing, Alejandro rose from his cot as the floor trembled beneath the impact. He knew the sound of those grenades. He had trained with teams like this before, relief mixed with urgency. His rescuers were close, but until they reached him, he was still caged prey. Two ICE officers rushed to his cell, their rifles trembling. As they aimed at him, "On your knees. Don't move." One barked. Alejandro didn't flinch. He lifted his hands slowly, his calm demeanor unnerving them. "You're making the gravest mistake of your careers," he said evenly. "In 60 seconds, you won't be the ones in control." Before the officers could respond, the reinforced hallway doors blew inward with another controlled detonation. Smoke filled the corridor as figures in matte black armor stormed in, weapons raised, lasers slicing through the haze. The ICE officers froze, torn between defending their prisoner or protecting themselves. "Step away from the cell," a voice thundered in accented English. "Now." The younger ICE guard dropped his rifle instantly, but the older one hesitated, pride warring with fear. The hesitation lasted only a moment until a red laser dot traced across his chest. Steady and unyielding, he swallowed hard and backed away, with practiced efficiency. One operator knelt at Alejandro's bars, placing a charge on the lock. "Clear," he shouted, and the lock blasted free with a sharp crack. The door swung open, and for the first time that day, Alejandro was unshackled by men who actually knew who he was. Commander Vega stepped forward, removing his helmet just long enough for Alejandro to see his face. "Senator Torres," he said firmly, "we're here to extract you. Time is short." Alejandro's jaw tightened. "They access my equipment. Files are exposed. If ICE pulls them, entire operations could be compromised." Vega gave a sharp nod. "Then we secure the data before we leave." Meanwhile, across the facility, Agent Murphy staggered through the smoke-filled hallways, his fury boiling. He couldn't believe what he was witnessing: federal authority being undermined on U.S. soil by a foreign strike team. He grabbed his radio, shouting into it, "This is Agent Murphy with ICE. We are under armed attack. Send DHS, FBI, anyone now." But the comms were already jammed. Static filled the channel, cutting him off from reinforcements. Back in the operations room, Klein watched helplessly on the security monitors as the tactical team moved with terrifying precision. Every camera feed showed the same thing: ICE officers overwhelmed, their weapons confiscated, their positions collapsed. These weren't amateurs. This was a unit built for international extractions, and nothing ICE could do would stop them. Inside the holding wing, Alejandro followed Vega and his men, their formation shielding him as they advanced. They moved quickly through the labyrinth of corridors, neutralizing any resistance with swift disarms and non-lethal takedowns. Detainees in nearby cells watched wide-eyed, some pressing their faces to the bars, whispering in awe as the mysterious team passed by. When they reached the operations room, Alejandro pointed to his confiscated laptop, still glowing on the evidence table. "There, secure it." An operator snatched it up, inserting a small device that began wiping sensitive data. "Clean slate in 60 seconds, he confirmed, but before they could move, Murphy burst into the room, rifle raised, his finger trembling on the trigger. His voice cracked with rage. "You can't just walk in here and take him. This is U.S. jurisdiction." Vega turned slowly, leveling his sidearm with chilling calm. "Jurisdiction ends when international law is violated. You detained an Interpol officer under false pretenses. Stand down, agent." Murphy's face twisted, caught between rage and disbelief. For the first time, he noticed the insignia etched onto Viga's armor, the unmistakable emblem of an international enforcement coalition. His breath caught. This wasn't just some rogue unit. This was sanctioned, and he was hopelessly outmatched. But pride was a dangerous thing. His finger tightened on the trigger, and Alejandro, standing shielded by his rescuers, whispered sharply, "Don't do it." The room crackled with tension, every breath drawn like the ticking of a clock about to strike midnight. Murphy stood, with his rifle raised, his knuckles wide around the grip. Sweat trickled down his forehead, but his eyes burned with defiance. Across from him, Commander Viga's weapon was steady, unwavering, its red dot fixed on Murphy's chest. The rest of the tactical unit fanned out, their formation tight, their weapons covering every angle. Alejandro stepped forward slightly, his voice slow, but sharp. "Murphy, listen to me. If you pull that trigger, this won't end the way you think. You'll start a war you cannot win." Murphy spat the words like venom. "War? This is my country. You don't get to waltz in here with your foreign soldiers and tell me how to do my job." Viga's tone remained icy, controlled. "Your job is to enforce the law. Instead, you have violated international law. You detained an accredited officer, with diplomatic immunity. That makes you the criminal here." The words landed like blows, but Murphy's pride wouldn't allow him to yield. He tightened his stance, his finger brushing the trigger. In the corner of the room, Klein appeared, panting from his sprint through the facility. His eyes widened as he saw the standoff. "Murphy, for God's sake, put it down. We're outgunned. We don't even know who they are." Murphy snarled, "They're invaders, Klein, and you want me to just roll over?" Alejandro's voice cut through the noise, calm but commanding. "Look at me, Murphy. Do I look like a smuggler? A trafficker? A cartel hitman? No, I am the man who hunts them. The reason your city is drowning in blood is because of the work my team and I do." He turned slightly, addressing everyone in the room now. 3 months ago, I infiltrated a cartel syndicate that has been funneling weapons across your border. Those weapons, meant for cells operating inside the U.S., I tracked shipments, traced leaders, identified sleeper contacts work your agencies couldn't touch because the network crosses 5 countries. I had them cornered, and then you arrested me. The ICE officers shifted uneasily, their rifles lowering ever so slightly. The weight of his words began to sink in. Klein muttered under his breath, "Cartels. Weapons inside U.S. borders." Alejandro nodded. "If my files were breached, if those names were exposed, you didn't just compromise me, you compromised dozens of undercover operatives. Men and women who will die because you didn't verify who I was before you threw me in a cell." For a moment, silence dominated the room. Even Murphy hesitated, his jaw working as he processed Alejandro's statement. But pride and anger were dangerous bedfellows. His voice cracked with rage. "How do we even know you're telling the truth? Anyone can throw around the word Interpol. Anyone can claim they're saving the world, but I know what I see another foreigner breaking the law." Viga's patience snapped, his voice cut like steel. "Enough." He lowered his weapon slightly, but gestured sharply, and 2 of his men surged forward, disarming Murphy with brutal efficiency. The rifle clattered to the floor, skidding across the tiles. Murphy roared in protest, struggling, but a swift twist of his arm forced him to his knees. Klein raised his hands instinctively, stepping back. "Wait, don't hurt him, please. Just tell us what's happening." Alejandro turned to Klein, his expression softer now. "What's happening is bigger than you realize. The cartel leaders I was tracking, they're not just smugglers. They're tied to a shadow network funding violence in 3 continents. The U.S. is only one of their targets. Europe, South America, Africa, they span it all. That's why Interpol involved. That's why I am here. And that's why Viga's men just risked everything to break me out." He paused, his gaze narrowing. "And do you know who tipped ICE off to my location?" Klein frowned. What do you mean? Alejandro's jaw clenched. A leak. Someone in your own chain of command passed information to the cartels. They wanted me neutralized. They knew ICE would move quickly on a suspicious foreigner. It was the perfect trap and you walked right into it. Gasps rippled through the room. The accusation hung heavy in the air. Vega backed him up, his tone grim. Our intel confirms it. Communications intercepted hours ago show that a cartel informant inside a federal office funneled Alejandro's address to ICE. They expected you to take him off the board, and you did. Klein's face paled, his earlier confidence draining away. You're saying someone in our agency is dirty. Alejandro's voice was steady. Not someone, multiple, and unless we move now, they will know I'm alive and they will strike again. As if on cue, an explosion rocked the facility from outside. The walls trembled, dust showering from the ceiling. Detainees screamed in panic. Vega's comms crackled with an urgent update. Commander, enemy contact outside perimeter. Armed, cartel vehicles, heavy weapons. They're making a push. Vega's expression hardened instantly. So, they came faster than expected. Murphy, still on his knees, sneered bitterly. You brought this here. This blood will be on your hands. Alejandro shook his head. No, they came because of your mistake. And now we either fight together or none of us make it out alive. The second explosion hit closer, rattling the glass in the observation windows. Through the haze of smoke and sirens, the sound of automatic gunfire echoed outside. The cartel strike team had arrived, determined to finish what ICE had unknowingly started. Alejandro turned to Vega, his voice sharp and resolute. We can't just extract any more. We hold the line. We protect the files, we protect the agents inside this building, and we shut the cartel down before they breach these walls. Vega gave a curt nod. Then it's war. The tactical unit snapped into motion, locking down positions, setting up barricades, preparing for the siege. ICE agents, shaken but realizing the truth, began falling into line, their training instinct overriding their doubts. Even Klein picked up a rifle, his face grim but determined, the lines between ICE, Interpol, and the special unit blurred as the reality set in. Survival meant unity. And as the cartel's assault intensified, Alejandro knew this night would decide everything: his mission, his operatives, and possibly the fragile trust between nations. For the first time, ICE and Interpol would fight side by side. And the battle was about to begin. The night outside the ICE detention facility had transformed into a battlefield. Muzzle flashes lit up the dark as cartel gunmen opened fire with heavy rifles and mounted machine guns. The roar of engines mixed with the sharp crack of gunfire, and the air vibrated with chaos. Smoke curled above the compound, and the metallic clang of bullets ricocheting against steel echoed through the air. Inside, the alliance of necessity was forged. Vega's tactical team moved with practiced precision, setting up barricades with flipped desks, overturned filing cabinets, and steel doors ripped from hinges. ICE agents, still shaken from the earlier invasion, scrambled to fall into defensive positions. Fear was written on many faces, but the gravity of the moment united them tonight. They either stood together, or they would all be cut down. Alejandro crouched beside Vega at the command post they'd set up near the evidence room. He checked the magazine of a confiscated ICE sidearm, his movements efficient and calm. He wasn't a soldier, but years in the field meant he had fought alongside them often enough. Vega glanced at him. Extraction is no longer an option. We fight until reinforcements arrive. Alejandro shook his head. Reinforcements won't come in time. The cartel wants my files. If they get inside, they'll know every operative embedded in their ranks. We can't let that happen. He pointed to his laptop, still connected to the wiping device. That drive has the last copy. Protect it at all costs. Klein, standing nearby with a rifle he clearly wasn't used to holding, looked pale but determined. You mean we're the last line? Yes, Alejandro said grimly. And the only one. The first breach came at the east wall, a cartel truck slammed into the perimeter gate, and gunmen spilled out, their shouts carrying over the gunfire. The tactical unit unleashed controlled bursts, cutting down the first wave with surgical accuracy. ICE agents fired alongside them, there earlier, hostility replaced by raw survival instinct. The clash was brutal, a storm of lead and fire, but the defenders held. Murphy, still bristling with anger, but armed once more, shouted over the chaos, "They just keep coming. We can't hold forever." Alejandro returned fire from a shattered window, his jaw set. "We don't have to hold forever, just long enough to break them." Another explosion rocked the building, this time closer. Dust rained from the ceiling as the cartel deployed RPGs, punching holes into the facility's outer walls. Through one of the breaches, gunmen poured in, only to be met by Viga's men in close quarters combat. The hallway became a maelstrom of smoke, shouting, and gunfire at point-blank range. Amid the chaos, Alejandro spotted a cartel operative slipping past the firefight, heading straight for the evidence room where his laptop was kept. Without hesitation, Alejandro sprinted after him. The man kicked the door open, rifle raised, but Alejandro tackled him from behind, slamming him against the metal frame. The rifle skidded across the floor. They grappled fiercely, the cartel soldier snarling in Spanish, "You won't stop us. The network is eternal." Alejandro gritted his teeth, driving a knee into the man's gut before wrenching him to the ground. With practiced efficiency, he subdued him, but the message lingered. This was bigger than even he had anticipated. When he emerged back into the corridor, he saw Murphy covering a group of ICE officers, firing steadily at advancing cartel forces. For the first time, Murphy's anger seemed redirected not at Alejandro, but at the men outside trying to kill them all. Their eyes met briefly across the chaos, and in that unspoken moment, Alejandro saw the shift. Pride had given way to grim reality. The battle raged on for nearly an hour, each wave of cartel fighters more desperate than the last. At one point, Viga himself was grazed by shrapnel, blood streaking his sleeve, but he fought on with relentless focus. ICE and the tactical team moved as one now, shouting orders, dragging the wounded to safety, firing in unison. Finally, the distant roar of jet engines announced the arrival of reinforcements. U.S. military aircraft streaked overhead, unleashing a show of force that shattered the cartel's morale. Vehicles peeled away, gunmen scattered, and those who remained were swiftly neutralized by coordinated fire. The siege was over. Inside the battered facility, silence returned slowly, broken only by the groans of the wounded and the hiss of smoke drifting through the halls. Alejandro leaned against the wall, sweat and soot streaking his face. Viga clasped his shoulder. "We held the line." Barely. Murphy approached, his usual arrogance muted. He looked at Alejandro, his voice quieter than it had ever been. "I misjudged you, misjudged everything. If what you say is true, we nearly destroyed something bigger than we can imagine." Alejandro met his gaze, his tone firm but not cruel. "Mistakes like this cost lives. Remember that the next time you see a man and judge him by the papers he carries or doesn't carry." Klein stepped forward, his rifle hanging loosely at his side. "What happens now to him?" He nodded toward Alejandro. Viga answered for him. "Now, we take him back to finish his mission. And your agency will be answering questions about how this happened." Alejandro looked around the wrecked facility, the shattered glass, the bullet-pocked walls. The ICE officers slumped in exhaustion beside Viga's men. For a moment, he saw something rare. Unity born not of trust, but of survival. Maybe it wouldn't last. But maybe, just maybe, it was a start. As he walked toward the exit with Viga and his team, the rising sun painted the horizon in shades of gold and red. The helicopters waited, engines humming, ready to lift them out of the smoldering battleground. Alejandro cast one last look back at the facility. "Everything changes now," he murmured. "The cartel knows we're close, and We won't get another chance. Vega nodded. Then we finish it. The rotors thundered overhead, lifting them into the dawn sky. Below, ice agents watched in silence, the weight of the night pressing heavily on their shoulders. The war wasn't over. But tonight, lines had been drawn, truths had been revealed, and enemies had been unmasked, and Alejandro Torres, Interpol officer, hunted and betrayed, was still standing, ready for what came next.